Thank you, Benjamin, for inviting me to this meeting and to be in this sacred city and talk about religion, of course, and in a sometimes provocative and sometimes sociological, sometimes juridical way. And my paper will deal much more from the other side, from the population perspective, in a much more political, sociological perspective. And I would say that religion is like language. It's closely related to national identity. The same can be said about secularism. Secularism in European states are related to their national identity, to their national history. In France, for example, the movement of emancipation that followed in the Enlightenment extracted the individual from their religious and communal constraints and promoted integration into the political community comprised of individual citizens. Here I would like to remind something. At the Napoleon time with the emancipation, Clermont de Tonnerre said, at that time the only community that was perceived as a religious community being the Jewish community, he said, give everything to the Jews as individual and don't give anything to the Jews as a nation. So that was ideologically to bring the individual, to extract the individual from its community and integrate them into the political community through individual citizenship. Ideology, rhetoric, but reflected in the society and in the laws. So in Germany, another example, as a result of a long term of influence of the Reformation and religious wars, religious communities took a corporate character. Today, in both countries and in many European countries, the return of religion to public debate is associated with the settlement of post-colonial migrants who are mostly Muslims. Those Muslims who have become citizens in the West today, but who have been outside of the history of the relationship between church and state that shaped Western national character. And today, these Muslims are demanding recognition and representation for Islam within national societies. This recognition, this claim is perceived as a challenge to secularism. But more than that, I will say that, moreover, public recognition and representation of Islam challenges democratic states' approach to diversity and multiculturalism more than the secularism. And multiculturalism encounters a dichotomic view between opposing assimilation and multiculturalism. In order to resolve the conflicts that Islam brings to secularism today, that have emerged in the public space and in the political community, contradicting this principle, rhetoric, ideology of secularism in different countries, and liberal democratic societies need to respond to two complementary pressures. One is institutional, and the other is political. Institutionally, the secular state is under pressure. We can define secular, is under pressure either to reshape its institutions so that provide general recognition for Islam on the same footing as other recognition of other religions in their societies, or as Piku Barek in Great Britain suggests, extend the existing institutions to the new emerging Islam in European societies. At stake here is the institutional assimilation, I maintain the term, institutional assimilation of diversity. Politically, and let me become a little bit normative here, I would say states must find the means by which equal institutional representation and individual national citizenship can be reconciled. How can Muslims be integrated into the political community? How can common membership be promoted on a common civic culture defined that allows citizens to find adequate identification? It's not only to create an institution, but also to promote identification with these institutions. What is at stake in the contemporary acceptance of Islam as a part of European historical continuity? So both approaches suggest the necessity of contextual analysis. Here I will compare much more France and Germany, the two countries that I studied, and then in this paper I will try to show and I will analyze Islam as an emerging ethnicity, emerging ethnicity in European countries. And for this, I will first talk about how I see this as an emergent ethnicity, and analyze secularism and laïcité, that were French exception as it has become with facing these issues, and how recognition, institutional recognition, fits into this understanding of secularism and laïcité. And my last point will be transnational Islam in Europe, and how transnational Islam, what kind of state relationship with states that brings this transnational solidarity of Muslims in different European countries, established Muslims in these European countries. So talking about ethnicization, I would say in France, for example, one aspect of assimilation has been the acceptance or internalization by immigrants of the separation between religion and public life. Historical studies have pointed out that the cult of assimilation as the basis of national unity produced in citizens as indifference to separate linguistic and religious origins, which became obscured and suppressed in private life. And once you pass through the means of institutions, it's a part of your assimilation. The same was true in the early 20th century Germany, where Germanization meant forced assimilation with reference to language and not reference to religion. However, can we suppress religion from our culture and traditions? French anthropologist Georges Ballandier emphasized that, I'm quoting him, it is in religion, especially in cultural ecclesiastic institutions, that traditions find its most solid anchor. And many studies show that many studies on immigration show that newcomers who came to European countries or who migrated anywhere find it a first anchor around religious institutions. There are examples of Italians and Poles in France, for example, how they created their own church, even though they came to a country with the same cultural religion, if I can put it in these terms, and they wanted to have their own church with their own priest. So did the Muslims. When they arrived in the 1970s, they wanted to have their own imam to help the families with the traditions and reproduction of some religious norms and culture, and also some moral values, as they would put. So religion in this context is limited to the private spheres of the family and local community. Even though Islam is defined by immigrants themselves in terms of practice, tradition and moral values, its perception as a permanent difference, quote unquote, I should say, both by immigrants and public authorities, constitutes a step towards the construction and the recognition of an ethnic group, generating an awareness of belonging. Here I would like to quote a Turkish businessman living in Berlin, actually he's German citizen, who said, "The Germans want to make us German, but it will take several years. They might succeed in assimilating us, but our religion will persist." And here I think he emphasizes this understanding of permanent difference that will persist. Actually, I'll continue later. While in the 1960s and 70s, when the first migrants came, their first mobilization and was mainly around the working class phenomenon, unions, and the churches helped them to get organized around these issues. And then in the 80s, there has been a change all over Europe with identity politics and recognition stories, etc., and identities of origin that has emerged. Then identities, whatever the identity is, started to be defined within voluntary associations that got visibility and recognition by the French state because it was not allowed before. And these voluntary associations have become a refuge, sometimes a sanctuary, and where culture, religion, ethnicity, nation were interpreted, became manifest, and took root. So in France, again, with the proliferation of these associations, Islam has become an agent of reaction, of discourse, of action and reaction. This discourse alternated with actions to build one or more identities from de facto minority situation around what is perceived on both sides, as I said, permanent difference. Even the so-called secular organizations, associations, integrated in their activities celebration of holidays, Muslim holidays like the Ramadan, and also some Quranic courses. So from comprising only one component of culture in early secular association, Islam has now become to signify culture in its entirety and has become another way of reappropriating identity. Such an appropriation has been crystallized around the scarf affair. And scarf affair was significant in the sense that it gave an awareness to both parts, to the French state, French society, French institutions on the one hand, to a whole population, Muslim population, who didn't identify themselves as Muslim as such, but at the beginning, gave this awareness of being settled in French society, and on the other hand, that this is the core identity of the Muslim population around which they should be organized and make some claims. So the event unleashed a flood of commentary on identity of the migrants, identity of the nation. Maybe here also, I will say also about the secularism, the emphasis lay on Islam and its compatibility with the secular principle of the French society. In short, the issue brought in the public opinion the ambiguity of the definition of laïcité. What is laïcité? Is it tolerance? Is it neutrality? Is it distance? It has not become very clear even after months of debates. And the only thing that I would say, the headscarf made the principle of laïcité after the headscarf in 89. Laïcité went through several definitions to establish itself, I would say, as an official religion of France. Today, if I may say so, today Islam is at the core of the redefinition of the laïcité, and Islam has served as a mirror to the definition of laïcité. I agree with you. There is all this cultural element, but I wouldn't contest the constitution, but I would bring this Christianity normativity and perception of a society in their understanding of an order. And this is not, but Islam made it obvious. It brought as a mirror to say that what is secularism and what is laïcité. Laïcité is being perceived as a French exception, and I would say the French religion. So headscarf was perceived as a challenging the long historical process of national assimilation and transformation, not of the peasant into the Frenchman, as Eugene Weber said, but of the immigrant, Muslim immigrant into a Frenchman. So, as France was suffering from an existential crisis caused by the challenge of secularism with the headscarf, and Germany didn't understand what was going on in France. The example you gave, I think, is in Germany, and the question was, what is France doing? Don't they know that they have so many Muslims and they will be with scarves, etc.? But the interpretations of the German case was twofold. One is Germany at that time defined still itself as not a country of immigration. So these people will go back. Who cares if they have a scarf? And besides, and the second is, Germany does not have the same relationship of church and state, and religion does not have the same understanding of total separation of church and state. So if Germany is not a country of immigration, so what is it? But, and when the debate started to become on citizenship, and when this Afghan teacher started to come to school with a scarf, the issue started to shake Germany too. So at the core of both cases is citizenship. And then this Afghan lady went to the Cairo, the Constitutional Court of Germany, and then she went to the European Court of Justice, and then she was banned, she was excluded by school, from teaching and by school. At the core was a civil servant representing a state and a teacher and a citizen wearing a scarf in public institutions. So how does Islam fit in this established understanding of secularism and laïcité in France and Germany. Coming to the French Constitution, I would say, according to the Article 2 of the French Constitution, that goes back to 1958, France is an indivisible, secular, we don't use the word secular, laïque, democratic, and social republic. It ensures equality to all of its citizens before the law without distinction of origin, race, and religion. It respects all beliefs. Since the legal separation of church and state in 1905, after 100 years of war between the church and the state, the principle of laïcité has been taken for granted in debates over church and state relations. Nobody would have questioned laïcité until then. This separation began with the Enlightenment, when laïcité was first defined as both as exit from religion and public use of individual reasons. But what does this mean concretely? Concretely, what comes with the headcarved issue is that laïcité is an institutional setting. It's not in the modalité. It is taken as granted, but is mainly an institutional setting because the debate started to become how do we represent, how do we give floor to Muslim population and reply their claims. In France, the separation of church and state confers institutional legal status to the Catholic clergy, to the Protestants, or with the Protestant of National Federation of the Protestant Churches, and, of course, with the consistoire to the Jews that goes back to Napoleon. The universality of secularism, however, relies on the principle of equality, according to which there is no domination of one religion on the national majority over other religions or in de facto minority. Minority situation. Although there is another thing that Islam challenges in France, and now Jews are getting on the same level also as a return. The French Republic, the French Republican rhetoric rejects the term of community and rejects the term of minority. So if you make claims for specificity, that means you are asking for a recognition of a minority religion that the French rhetoric will reject. But an institutional setting will come to recognize on the same level all the religions, which is and will come with the rhetoric of the freedom of conscience. In Germany, the philosophy of enlightenment, Aufklärung, was not against religion, like in France, just as rationality was not against Protestant piety. The concern for equality consisted mainly of destroying the barrier between the clergy, the nobility, the middle class, and the peasantry. In this sense, Aufklärung refers both to secularization and modernization. After the formation of the federal state, the Kulturkampf was characterized by an effort to guarantee social cohesion by minimizing the role of the Catholic Church while also limiting Protestant influence on politics. Traces of German secularism date back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which not only put an end to the religious war, but also asserted the superiority of territorial allegiances based on the principle of the whose realm their religion, and the decline of religion relative to secular power. German secularism expressed itself in terms of religious pluralism, with the recognition of Catholic and Protestant, and the denominational duality on these of these two religions, two denominations in the public sphere. This recognition resulted in the interpretation of ecclesiastical, social, and political structures that perpetuate two churches' denominational character of the present day. The basic law reinforces the article of the Weimar Constitution regarding freedom of conscience and religion. In addition, the law integrates the principle of separation of church and state and does not recognize an established church. The religions of freedom of Catholics and Lutherans assume a corporative nature, granting equal rights only to communities formed as corporations and recognized by the public law. So how do we do with, the difference between France and German secularism originates from their relationship from the relationship of religion in the public space and the civil society. Contrary to laïcité in France, which excludes religion from the public life, secularism in Germany, or secularization in Germany, constitutes Catholic and Protestant churches as corporate bodies in public law. In Germany, the churches are recognized in legal terms by the social and moral function, and the state levies taxes on their behalf, which is paid by all citizens who are members of these congregations. Churches therefore constitute semi-sovereign institutions according to Peter Kastenstein and enjoy an important role in the stability of German society, which you understand is not the way French will see the role of the church in the society, neither in the public institutions nor in the civil society. Different national histories, different interpretations and definitions of social cohesion led to two different institutional settings in France and Germany with regard to religion. In both national contexts, the distinctions between private and public and the neutrality of the state regarding religion are both sources of contradictions when the state comes to confront Islam. Although Islam constitutes one element of pluralism and diversity among ethnic groups in the United States, for example, Islam emerges as a minority religion in European nation states. Such a conceptual difference is reflected in different understanding and application of multiculturalism that we are all facing, and recognition of diversity in European countries. Recognition of diversity, politics of recognition, identity politics are all these fashionable words since the 1980s, and that as a response to either mobilization from below this population or state policies that took as this approach as a democratic grant for minority populations. So what place for Islam in this politics of recognition? As I said at the beginning, for me, the recognition is, as a citizen, of course, of citizens established, settled in those societies, and is institutional recognition. If French secularism is also an institutional setting, giving recognition to other religions on the same basis, then Islam should be recognized, would have been recognized on the same footing than other religions in the French, in the representation in the French institutions. After the scarf affair, from 1989 to 2003, each government tried to define how to represent Muslims and Islam in France. It took 15 years until Sarkozy, when he was the Minister of Interior, that they created this CFCM, Culte Français, non, Conseil Français du Culte Musulman, Conseil Français du French Council of Muslim Worship, that wanted to be a representative institution of Muslims in France. As I told you, it created a double challenge. One is a democratic response based on equality, institutional representation, and the other is a recognition of a minority in France. So this institution aims to represent Muslims in France, but actually it aims to organize a transition from Islam in France to Islam of France. So once you establish a national institution that represents Muslims, you cannot talk about Muslims in France as they were still migrants, but they are a part of the French institutions, they are a part of the society, and they are a part of the nation. So it comes for me to nationalize Islam, as to make a French Islam, like we have French Jewry, like we have French Jews. And actually there's a big, in their discourse, the discourse of the activists, there's a big rapprochement and the way they want to be represented and the way they will collaborate for acting against any issue that is raised. And the best example that you gave, but you didn't go further, the circumcision issue in Germany, for example, the halal meat and the kosher, and all these issues today that are targeted with regard to Muslims lead a reaction from the Jewish community, and they are putting them on the same issue with the same concerns, and one are Muslims of France, the other are Jews of France, and it's exactly the same understanding of being a minority, even though France does not want to recognize a minority anywhere again and still. So in Germany, recognition doesn't have the same meaning. For Germany, recognition is not institutional recognition because they can have an institutional recognition, but the institutional settings, Germany does want to see immigrants or any population to be organized in terms of community. But what they mean by community is this religious community represented by a religious institution and be taught at school in public schools. So the issue for Muslims, of course, is how Islam can be taught in public schools in Germany. Then in this case, it will come to the same equal fitting and as the other religions. And then how to obtain authorization by who? But I'm not telling you here, I don't want to detail this, but for all these representations, there is a huge fight, not between states and the population we are talking about, but within the population we are talking about. There is no such thing as one Muslim population. Muslims represent many nationalities, at least 2 or 3 denominations. Nationalities matter because they all come from nation states, decolonized sovereign states, and they want to be the representative. Each state want to be representative of Islam in France, like Moroccans, for example, want to take over this organization, or Tunisians, not Tunisians, Moroccans in France, and fighting with Algerians to be at the head of this institution, Turks in Germany, and among the Turks in Germany, are we talking about this official Turkish religious organizations or dissident Turkish religious organizations? So the whole fight is to find a common ground among this population who will play the game in this negotiation with states in order to be representative. So, but in any case, I believe in the institutional assimilation, as I say, and an institutional approach maintains both the role of the state as a legitimate source of power and a legal and democratic guarantor of equal representation and citizenship. This approach emphasizes a historical continuity and the importance of context in either a descriptive or normative analysis of identities. Asking for recognition as a minority allows a group that declares a specific identity to emerge from their political marginality and thus express a struggle for liberation. But unlike the liberation of the Enlightenment, which separated religion from the public life and the individual from the community to guarantee his essential identification with the national community, the demand for recognition in this case is swamped by a desire for participation with equal rights for religious community identities, which the structures of both state and society. Okay, but while the political and normative issue remains justice and equality, the social issue is ethnicization of a religious minority, which is with Islam as the main identity element that's cementing a legitimate community. If representation also leads to legitimacy, and if legitimacy is given to religious institutional representation, then religion becomes the legitimate identity to recognize by the state. Although not all Muslims necessarily recognize themselves within such an institutional representations, like not all the Jews recognize themselves in the consistoire, for example. They express their need for social and cultural inclusion and mobilize against racism, discrimination, or any other form or exclusion. The question then is, does institutional justice compensate for social injustice? I see you doing this. Can demand for recognition be limited to official representation when other institutions, such as schools, are not fulfilling their function in integrating and promoting civic values. All these rhetorics that are in the parties and in the press and in the official documents as a basis for social, cultural, and religious equality. Religious diversity and its expression in the public sphere has imposed new realities to Western Europe and will require a continued redefinition of the relationship between religion and state in order to calm the tensions within society and the political community. A new social contract combining reason and religion. Obviously, if religion appears empirically as the main cleavage today, its recognition in France and Germany can be seen as a means for incorporating Muslims. But this will require to go beyond a solely institutional approach and developing tools for Muslim identification within national institutions. Nevertheless, institutional assimilation constitutes an important step toward the acceptance of the other, which is possible if mentalités open up along with the institutional changes. For this to occur, social and political discourses, along with discourse and the media, must help immigrants, new citizens, to identify with the state and its institutions. For Muslims, French and German national identification can help to liberate them from external political forces of the home country and of transnational networks, and push them to participate fully in the political community. That's why I urge the states to play much more the card of equal citizenship in order to liberate this population from external pressures. Through this perspective of liberation, the law banning all suspicious signs of religion in public school should be understood. Law alone cannot help to liberate the individual, especially when the individual is a woman, with the concern of the scarf. You didn't mention the burqa. Burqa was an even bigger issue, actually, and less legitimate than the headscarf in France. And I say law only cannot help the individual to liberate the individual from community pressure in concentrated areas like the banlieues, like the ghettos, etc. Still, such a law is important for liberating Muslims from Islam as a political force that weighs on Muslim migrant communities wherever they are settled. So in my last point, and I will conclude this, I will talk very briefly about this transnational organization and solidarity of Muslims all over Europe. We don't have any statistics, but we can see more and more how solidarities are being shaped, how the nationality of origin that weight on national institutions disappear in this European solidarity that is being developed, and through networks. These networks are built on common interests, defined and formulated at the European level in terms of equality of rights, and there are two kind of re-centralization of these multiple identities of Muslim. One is to fight against racism and equality before supranational institutions, European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, for example, and the other is re-centralized around an identity that is being formed as being Muslim in Europe, European Muslims. So organizations, home countries help to this development, special organizations help for this development, but I think the most important would be when this development will come from their own networks in order to define themselves as European Muslims. Although, the elaboration of these transnational networks and structures reveals these multiple references of allegiances to the host country, to the home country, and to Europe and to this transnational network, like a diaspora. A loyalty that is not only to a home and host country, but also a loyalty to a diaspora that can be this transnational network on the European level. But this is also at the core of the tension between states and this population settled in different countries. And this solidarity with a network, loyalty to a network more than a state is another source of tension, of course. But transnationality is paradoxical. The consolidation of a transnational solidarity comes also to influence the state from outside. And even if it contributes to the formation of external communities and creates these tensions, transnational networks today are imposed onto states and their national public authorities, who define the limits of their legitimacy and indispensable structures for negotiation of collective identities and interests. I don't think any European member state of the European Union will take the intervention of any European court as a ingerence in their own decisions. This is the game of the European Union. They have these institutions, have their normative role, and they have to play on this role. And then there's a big claim organization of these networks before these supranational institutions in order to have an effect on the states. This is one of the paradoxes of the transnationalism within Europe. In other words, the ultimate goal is to reach a political representation that can only be defined on a national level. Rights and interests for non-European residents and citizens can be only given by the state. By all claims at the national level today imply a parallel pressure at the European level, and conversely, all claims at the European level aim to have an impact on decisions taken on the national level with each member state concerning them. For the Muslim population in Europe, a transnational organization of interest which employs identity in order to win recognition at European level reflects the Europeanization of a political action. But Muslims are not the only one. There's many interest groups that are acting on the same way in Europe, but it does not involve the Europeanization of their claim, of their demand. The latter remained linked to the state, the body which remains the only solid framework of references and mobilization and negotiations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for these two lectures. One rather bottom up, and the other one, the other way around, top down. So we have two perspectives. Let's open the floor for discussions. We have decent time, 30 minutes, 35 minutes. So please.
I wanted to ask Professor Yakobson concerning the attitude of the new Egyptian constitution with Fattah al-Sisi in comparison with the European constitution. I can start again. First of all, I would like to thank you for your very comprehensive lecture concerning several European constitutions and also in practice toward minorities, religious minority, especially Islamic minorities, and to some extent also to Jewish communities. I would like to ask you if you can do any comparison between any of the European constitution vis-à-vis the Egyptian constitution of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi toward the Christian minority, especially the Copts, which is a big community in the constitution and also in the practice. Thank you.
As far as the constitution goes, the Egyptian constitution has said so under Mubarak. There were some changes under the Muslim Brothers and has been rolled now back. But it still has been saying throughout those times two things. Islam is the religion of state, and Sharia is, I think, not the main, but a main source of legislation. A main source of legislation. Now, a religion of state, you can find parallels in Europe when you say established religion in Denmark, when you speak about the text of the constitution, not the reality. But to say that Sharia is a major source of legislation, there is no parallel in any European state for that. And naturally, in Christianity, there is no parallel for what you have in both Judaism and Islam, which is that the religion itself is a legal system and not just a system of belief and religious practice. So on paper, all Arab constitutions, including the relatively secular ones, are more religious than any European constitution. Although they differ also in the degree of religiosity. And Sisi's constitution is somewhat less religious than the Muslim Brothers who pushed it a little bit. Not by far, by the way. The main difference was in practice. In practice, the Coptic minority in Egypt is treated worse than any Muslim minority, obviously, in Europe, because Europe is, the liberal democracy in Europe is considerably better developed than in Egypt.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. Also, a remark and a question to Alex. The remark is regarding the kippah as a Jewish religious emblem. A couple of weeks ago, the Pope visited here, and he was shown in the same picture with President Perez and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the only one of the three who wore a kippah was the Pope. So I would be very cautious. The question is that when I was doing research on one of my books on European Islam, I visited Malmö in Sweden, and I engaged in a market, on Sunday market, an Arab who just came from North Africa, and I asked him, how did he feel? He was, wonderful, because Sweden is a very generous country, they gave him this and this and that. I said, well, you seem to be very happy. He said, no, there is one problem that bothers me, which is that now I am a Swede, and the flag of Sweden is my flag, and it hurts me that there is a cross on the flag. Now, according to your analysis, does he have a case?
On the kippah, I don't know if kippah is strictly a halachic obligation or not. I know one thing. Religious Jews don't like to be prevented from wearing it by non-Jewish governments. I would say also secular Jews don't. Most of them wouldn't approve that. So there is a problem there. Whether the headscarf is strictly a religious Sharia duty or not, there is a problem. I'm not saying you must never do it. What I am saying, if you ban a Muslim headscarf in a German public school, you cannot then make an exception for Christian nuns. That is a problem. If you do it in the French way, you are consistent. This is one situation. I wouldn't vote for that personally, but I'm not saying it's not legitimate. In the German way, it's problematic. I'm not sure it will survive the further judicial challenges. On the cross, you are asking a normative question. In my view, it is legitimate for a state to say that a certain religion forms an important element of its national culture, and to express this fact by national symbols, including the cross. If someone will suspect that I am influenced by what I think about the legitimacy of the Star of David on the Israeli flag, I will not argue with such a person, okay, such a suspicious person. So this is fine. This is legitimate. You may choose to do that, or you may choose not to do that, as the French, not to do that. Then there is, everybody agrees that there is then should be full equality of citizens, full religious freedom, I would say, and precisely when you define your symbols in such a way that there is a minority among your citizens who may feel estranged, don't have to, but may feel, then you have to make an extra effort to make it clear that this is not what the symbol wants to convey. How exactly you do that also depends, on the attitude of the minority. I'm not very far from saying that minority is always right in every tension between majority and minority. But there should be a genuine, I think, it should be the genuine aim of every country to accommodate minorities, not by accepting every demand, but by asking ourselves, so each nation, are we doing our best to enable those from the minority who want to be part of the country and full-fledged citizens to feel so? This is the idea.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My question is also to Professor Yakobson, and it concerns the Scandinavian examples, which I found very interesting. Just two things, that a recent study about the Danish situation. Sorry? A recent... A recent study about the Danish situation has shown that even though, of course, the churches tend to be pretty empty in Denmark, but a lot of individuals, in fact, I think the majority, actually claim that they have some kind of face. So it's very individualized, very private, and maybe it doesn't go very deep, but it's somewhere there. As far as Norway is concerned, I remember the word humanist was mentioned in the part of the constitution that you quoted. That reminded me of something which I learned last year when I was there, that the humanist movement is becoming very, very strong in Norway. And it is totally non-religious as far as members, I said members claim. I said members because it seems that they are institutionalizing the humanist movement from the grassroots up in a way which reminds me very much of religious institutions, even though they claim not to be religious. So children at a certain age, they go to classes, and they study sort of and learn humanist values, and eventually they pass an exam at a certain age, and they like doing that, and so on. So these two examples show me that in spite of these countries having pretty much empty churches, but there is something down in society which sort of makes claims to a certain types of either religiosity or institutions which somehow go that way. And hence my question, how do you explain the discrepancy or the contradictions that you have pointed out between observed reality, empty churches on the one hand, and the constitutions? Is it just a conservative residue? Or is it a reflection of something which the legislators actually observe happening in their own societies? Thank you.
There is a saying in Israel that the synagogue to which most Israelis do not go is Orthodox. Okay, so in that sense, I think that the church to which most Norwegians and most them do not go is the Lutheran, evangelical Lutheran church, and they are very aware of it. So there is a difference between level of actual observance and the feeling that this is part of your culture and your tradition. Now, there are also militantly secularist groups that reject it, but when the Constitution says Christian and humanistic, they do not contrast it at all. They think this is complementary rather than opposing. This is what they see. Now, in Norway's case, this is certainly not just a result of conservatism, because the old text of the Constitution was a result of the fact that it had been written in the mid-18th century, 19th century. So it said that everyone belonging to the church is bound to bring their children therein. Okay, so there was a legal obligation to educate children as good Lutherans. This is nonsense. I'm quite sure this did not have any meaning. But what the present text, as it was formulated 3 years ago, it is a fresh, up-to-date formulation of they lowered the level of connection between the church and state, but did not totally disband it. So what this means that there is a question of identity and question of religiosity, and these are in Quebec, for example. It is now a very strongly secular. It used to be the Catholic Church used to be a very important part of the actual life and culture of Quebec. It was a half-clerical province. Now it is one of the most secular provinces in Canada. It is less religious than the Protestant Anglophone provinces. The churches are pretty empty, but there's still a cross on the, and they still keep it in the National Assembly. So I would say there are two faces to such things. One is you want to affirm the roots of your culture, and it is not, I don't want to sound cynical about it, there is a logical historical connection between Christianity and secularism. There is. It is not untrue to say that secularism in its present form is a certain result of a certain historical development in Europe and not in other places. So at best you say this is your way to say we believe in democracy, freedom, and we don't want to forget about our past, want to respect our tradition, we respect Christianity without necessarily going to church. This is I would say, the positive part of it. Then the not necessarily positive part of it is this is a statement against the minority. This is a statement against the minority. You are not, this is a Christian country, okay, although we do not go to church. Now, where the first stops and the second starts, that could be disputed. But I think both elements are present. And by the way, if it is a statement against those elements of the minority that challenge Western democracy, then the statement itself is quite legitimate. But there is more to it than that sometimes.
I have a question to Riva Kastoryano. Are there differences in France between Muslims coming from various countries towards Islam in France, more specifically between Moroccan and Algerians? And I'm asking this specifically because often I read about tensions that are taking place around the Mosque of Paris between Algerians and Moroccans. So can you say more on this?
Does this work? Actually, yes. On many levels. On a sociological level, the average, the way Algerians are perceived are assimilated, secularized, assimilated. But lately what we see with some who were marginalized got involved with nationalist religious mobilization in Algeria. This is different. I mean, they are French citizens, etc. That's why I'm talking about external forces. Morocco is a totally different story. It's a totally Moroccan state intervening in immigration all over Europe. Since the Madrid attacks, Morocco is very much involved in the definition of Islam in Europe, the organization of Islam in Europe, and not only of Moroccan Islam, but all over. And they are competing with Turkey and Morocco being very present in European organization of Islam, of their Muslims. And of course, they don't have the same relationship to the understanding of integration, assimilation, and also to Islam. And even after 3 generations, 4 generations, when we can think that the national influence is going away or fading away, you see that states coming in with the definition of their Islam. And European societies and European states agree with this, and they build a cooperation with that because of poverty, social exclusion issues that are being putting forward. And if their home country can bring this back in these societies, it will be a positive thing for European Muslims. But usually it's a source of suspicion, of course. But besides the state's population on their own, Algerians are perceived as French, Moroccans are perceived as Muslims, Turks are perceived as Muslim Turks. So you have these differences among them.
Can you say more about the struggles in the Mosque of Paris between Algerians?
Because of the CFCM, the European, the council, because they are fighting for the representation. You have 2 states fighting through different organizations. And who is going to represent French Islam, Algeria or Morocco? So it's much more, that's the issue. You don't, states don't, and transnational networks and world forces on Islam don't leave Muslim population to be classical citizens everywhere. That's why I believe in states force to struggle with external forces in order to bring them back in the societies where they live. And but mostly these fights are generated from external forces.
Please.
I have one question for Professor Yakobson and I have one question from Professor Yakobson and one for Dr. Kastoryano. For Professor Yakobson, is there a discussion of the question of sovereignty in these constitutions which you surveyed? I am asking this because in the preamble to the Pakistani constitution, the sovereignty belongs to God Almighty alone, but he has delegated it to the independent democratic state of Pakistan. So I wonder whether something of this sort you would have. Probably not, but I'm still giving the opportunity to say no. The question to you is, how are these representative organizations of the Muslims organized? Are they appointed by some of the Zentralrat in Germany? Is it appointed? There are some procedures of election.
Totally fake.
Totally.
In the French case, for example, it was criticized as being a Napoleonic way of doing things. The state nominates, but it's anthropologically, it's interesting. According to the square meter of in a mosque of population who are going to the mosque, and who is the majority? Is Moroccans are if more Moroccans go to the mosque, according to the square meters they occupy, they will be representative. Doesn't make sense. That's why states of origin intervene. It's nominated, and it's a sort of election. But who votes? Who participates? Who is a candidate? How are they? I mean, how the process is being built is totally from the French state. And in Germany, the whole fight in different lenders for the instruction is who defines who will be the teacher to teach in what state. In Bavaria, with the CDU, CSU, it will be a different approach than Hamburg and Berlin, for example. So usually it's a fight among states of origin. It's a fight over the state of immigration because they don't want anything to be representative. They want to choose. And it's also, and I think the problem again here is that the real population is not involved in the whole participation. The process is just fake, just for the vitrine of having an institutional representation. No. Yeah.
On sovereignty, it's slightly more complicated. The substantive answer, of course, the people are sovereign and are officially sovereign. This is what every democratic constitution says. Although historically, of course, in England, the English Revolution, the formulas used in the English Revolution was that people under God are the sole source of power. So you may say that's a kind of a Pakistani statement, assuming that God has delegated his powers in a far-reaching way to the people of England. But they still said under God, of course, and it was not total lip service, but since God is a very limited legislator in Christianity, much less than in Judaism and Islam and Judaism, so this delegation is much more straightforward. Whereas in an Islamic country, it's always a question of Islamic law, not just of religion. But there is this idea that, and in fact you can say that in the American Declaration of Independence, it starts that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. So it starts with God, but then it immediately passes over to democracy and equality. The equality and democracy are a God-ordained order of things. They enjoy divine protection. This is what it means. Then in the Constitution, they don't mention God at all. But in the Declaration of Independence, the origin of all those things is supposed to be the creator. But this kind of creator, his main concern is to establish equality among human beings. Hence, there is democracy as a technical result of it. The only constitution, Western constitution, that has anything from this tradition is a Canadian one. The Canadian Constitution says, whereas Canada is based on principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God and the rule of law. They don't say democracy, they say supremacy of God and the rule of law. Now, you may imagine that in this country, secular parties would never allow, to the extent that they have anything to say, such a formula, because it may sound dangerous. In Canada, I assume nobody is afraid that supremacy of God might mean anything other than a liberal democracy. But since the Canadians are actually used to Her Majesty the Queen being the formal sovereign, I suppose they don't mind that the God is kind of a constitutional sovereign of the universe in the same sense.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kass.
Yeah, my statement relates to Professor Jakobson. You mentioned Austria in your lecture. I'm coming from Austria, and I would like to express that Austria belongs to the countries in which the normative level is not so important. So it is much more a significant gray zone that develops between the normative level and everyday practice. I just want to give two examples. The first example is the Constitution, which, as the Austrian Constitution, I think, is relatively neutral. Yeah? On the one hand. On the other hand, what confessions is concerned. On the other hand, Austria has a concordat with the Vatican, concluded in early 1930s, in which it is fixed that the Austrian state finances education, training of the Catholic clerus and has to finance university faculties and so on. It has no impact on the selection of Catholic universities professors. So one can say, practically, the Austrian state is biased. But once again, there is the practical level. Since the Austrian state cannot quit this concordat with the Vatican, because that would constitute an offense, so the Austrian state supports other religious and ethnic groups too, since practically 30... In
the same way, the same level?
Just not, it is not, of course, not a kind of concordat, but a written obligation. As soon as an ethnic or confessional group is articulating itself, claiming we are a specific group, the Austrian state would support autonomous administration. For instance, there is this Jewish body, there's a Muslim body, there's a Slovene body, there's a Croatian body, etc., etc. And what the Muslim body is concerned, Austria supports the education, since 1-2 years, the education of Muslim clergy and Muslim Hodjas. So it is practically the same in comparison with the Catholic case. So this is the first example. The second example is related to crosses in the schools. You mentioned that case. I don't know I know there is kind of law related to crosses in schools. I don't know the exact formulation, but anyway, practically the situation is that every school has a kind of parliament consisting of teachers, parents, and students. And this parliament decides about important things related to the school, and this body can decide not to have a cross in the classroom. It cannot decide to have Islamic symbol in the classroom, but it can decide not to have a cross in the classroom. And if the decision is taken in accordance, probably there would nobody be to claim to have a cross in the class. So things are rather difficult if we combine the normative level with everyday practice. I mean, it is not. I do not want to express that it is good to neglect the normative level, but we have to see both sides.
First of all, of course, we should always remember in all these discussions that, in fact, there is a very high level of toleration and pluralism and religious freedom for minorities in Europe, everywhere in democratic Europe. It is a very rare period in human history relative to any other period and to other places in the world. So nothing that we say here should obscure this basic fact, of course, and of course you cannot compare it with Egypt or other parts in the Islamic world as it is today. It is obvious. It should never be. Now, and it is also obvious that there is often a difference between what is written in the Constitution and practice. And by the way, there is also a difference between Constitution and laws and regulations. What you said is also normative. But the constitutional text doesn't always reflect even the normative, much less the social sphere in the full. It is nevertheless significant because it is something that the nation wants to say in public in a solemn way. So we should not neglect it, but as I said, no one would claim that Canada, because of God, because the supremacy of God in Canada doesn't make Canada any kind of a clerical state. Whereas the agnostic formulation in the Polish constitution does not, it's not a clerical state, but of course the power of the Catholic Church in Poland is incomparably greater than the power of any religion in Canada. So we have, these are very flexible things. Now interestingly in Italy, it is an order, a ministerial order has been reissued now that says that every classroom has to have the crucifix. And it is probably an answer to the attack. The Italian state and the Italian society felt to be under attack on this issue. I'm not sure why, but there was a rallying of most, not all, but most political forces. It was a right-wing conservative government, but it was supported by most of the left-wing opposition. Because for some reason that is not quite clear to me, the question of the crucifix became an issue of whether we in Italy are allowed to run things in our own way. And one would have expected this to be in response to a perceived Muslim challenge, but it wasn't a Muslim challenge. It was challenged by some agnostic lady who didn't want her children to be educated with the Quran. So these are very complicated issues. What I refer to is not that there is any danger of clerical Christian domination anywhere in Europe, even in Greece, despite its relatively clerical constitution. But the issue of Muslim headscarf and on some issues that are important to minorities on the level of preserving their religious way of life as they regard it, there the clash is not with Christianity directly, but with radical secularism. And it's a real dilemma. I'm not saying the dilemma should always be resolved in favor of the minority, but it is a real dilemma.
Please.
A question to Professor Kastoryano. With rivalries between the various Muslim groups you mentioned, and differing self-definitions, and the rivalry between Morocco and Turkey, what are the manifestations of a transnational Muslim solidarity in the social sphere?
The rivalry on the local level does not exist. Among population does not exist. Fights are local fights, ghetto fights. It can be gang fights. It's this kind of fights happen is a sort of a verbal and physical violence that are in all industrial societies, like in suburbs, in banlieues in France, in the ghettos of the Chicago in the 50s, 60s. We go through these issues. The transnational aspect is a more serious aspect that is a new trend that is not necessarily into this gang phenomenon, but the transnational aspect is using this gang phenomenon in order to recruit new kids. So this is the states intervene in order to stop, all states cooperate in order to stop, but in this new challenge for societies and for states and for the population themselves for the perception of Islam as such among this population is a new trend where states have something to do, where society has something to do. I don't think the issue is not a matter of integration and assimilation anymore. It's how to control any kind of attitude. We are talking about transnational forces. We are not talking about internet. Actually, one of the best examples here is not necessarily today France and Germany, but Britain. How these phenomena are developing in Britain. Pakistan is intervening in both ways, and what Pakistan represents for this population in Britain. How are they organized? How Britain is organizing the coup, who will be helping the British state, how British will develop a new rhetoric that will fit the jihadi rhetoric that you developed in your presentation that we find among these kids. So I think there is no as such rivalry, but among this population on the field, on the ground level, on the grassroots situation, is how they will intervene and how they will fight, to stop this violence that can be canalized, is canalized in different ways. Just one thing to Jakobson, I think I agree with you with the crucifix issue, but if we look chronologically, what the headscarf issue, right, I agree with you, it goes to the headscarf, where it became such a public phenomenon. It started in France and it went everywhere, then it became minaret, then it became something else, etc. This is Islam brought as a phenomenon, as a mirror to their secularism and the contradiction of the secularism. The contradiction even of laïcité. Now the new definition of laïcité in France is Catholic laïcité. And what Islam did is, for example, just an example, crucifix we don't have, it's in Germany, in Italy. In France, we have the Christmas tree in every school around Christmas. Nobody has ever challenged Christmas. It's like Thanksgiving in America. It's like everybody defines Christmas as a secular holiday. And Muslims who were, of course, offended, but started to mobilize with the scarf issue, wanted the public school to get rid of the tree.
If you are secular, then you have to be secular.
If you are secular, you have to be secular. And you have to have exactly the same. If you don't allow me to have my religious sign in the public sphere, the school is the public sphere. So the tree was some schools negotiate. All is local negotiations. The scarf also is a local negotiation. You go to school. Who takes the girls with the scarves? Catholic schools and Jewish schools, because religious among religious. So they are live outside the public school. So, but what is going on now in Paris? Public sphere or public space or public institution, name it. Take Habermas in here, in front of the Mairie de Paris, the big mayor. You have every Christmas, you have the crèche. What is the crèche where Jesus was born? You know, the big house.
Crib.
What?
Crib.
What else? No. So you have, and everybody goes to visit and look and watch the birth of Jesus. Muslims do that too. It's a part of religiosity. So now you have two kinds of solidarity. Solidarity among seculars and solidarity among religions. All religions. You have emerging all kinds of institutions, interfaith dialogue, culture of civilization, dialogue of civilization, etc. So I think something that through the presence and visibility and claims and mobilization of Islam and reaction to Islam that brought religion into public sphere in a different way that constitutions didn't follow, not yet. But they will not follow because the constitutions are the basis for rhetoric and ideology and sign of sovereignty. They want to, actually it's very interesting to see the sociological dynamic. The crucifix came, and there was also another sign in German schools, another Scientologist, I don't remember, Steiner or something like this, a Scientologist. So everything that is religiously connected got now an effect that is like a effet de levier, a leverage thing, like an auction stuff, who is going to be more publicized and to which states will react in order to measure states' neutrality. Just a reaction.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have, yes, it's 12:30. I think we should come to an end of this first session. I think we had a very lively discussion, and both of these perspectives, of course, remind me to a rather tricky development that I would rather call it a kind of Islamization of the Muslims that is happening, in Europe. Similar to the Judification of the Jews in the 19th century. So this is something that one has to take into account, that majority perspectives do impact on minority and vice versa, as you have said, Islam as a mirror. So both are somehow constituting a very complex cultural ensemble where, minority and majority perceive and conceive each other, and so far. So